Welcome to the Sheffield Sunday As Bill Sees It's meeting. This is a main share meeting, and today it's with great pleasure and much gratitude that we welcome Tommy from New York, who's come to share for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open up for general sharing or if you would like to ask a question. So thank you so much, Tom. It's really wonderful to have you here. The floor is yours.
Good evening, good morning, actually good afternoon to all of you in England. I'm Tom, I'm an alcoholic, and I'm so glad to be with you this morning. I come to you by way of Donna J., who is one of my wise friends in recovery, and was contacted by Young, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share my experience, strength, and hope with you all. I picked this reading because, as Joseph Campbell said, it's a privilege of a lifetime to be who you are. And our founder in 1955 said to the convention assembled around him that our message to the world is not that we have succeeded in ceasing to drink, but that in ceasing to drink, we've begun to learn how to live. And were this only about ceasing to drink, I don't think it could ever have captured my productive imagination in the way it has. This has become definitely a way of life for me. And what are some of these transformations? To me personally, I'll share a few. I've gone from an emptiness that couldn't be filled to a fullness that can't be contained. I've gone from judgment to understanding. That doesn't mean I don't have days when I'm judgmental, but I have a program for that. I've gone from a reactive separateness to a conscious interconnectedness. I understand if I shut myself off from you, I shut myself off from God and from whom I really am. I've gone from a world-weary cynicism to rejoicing in the well-being of others. And after all, isn't that what our fellowship is really about? We get to rejoice in the well-being of each other, and when one of us is in trouble, we circle the wagons. And I've gone from a state of indifference to that of compassion. And it's been a long journey. Actually, the fact of the matter is, by some standards, I could be considered one of AA's biggest all-time losers. I arrived here on New Year's Eve, 1980. It was actually the cusp of 81. After burning my life to the ground, I weighed 270 pounds. I was as yellow as a canary with jaundice. I had serum hepatitis, alcoholic hepatitis, shaking apart. Recently, having finally deprescribed off of narcotics, but still drinking around the clock and addicted to cocaine. And I was done for the moment. What I found that New Year's Eve day and that evening was a group of people whom I'd been searching for all my life. I totally had the experience of being home, even though I was shaken apart and sweating. And they took me out dancing all night. And so everyone else was sweating too, so I didn't feel too badly. And we had breakfast as the sun came up. I wish I could say to you that that was the end of the story or the beginning of a non-continuous story. But the fact was, I didn't have surrender in my heart. I wasn't done yet. Finally, I came back to you all on February 23rd, 2018. I had reached that state of incomprehensible demoralization, that place that they talk about, in a vision for us, that stepping off place where I didn't know how I could live with alcohol or how I could live without it. Ray O'Keefe said I had reached that place, and this was true for me, beyond which by grace I was not permitted to go. Pain that any further I was not permitted to endure. And I came to you and I said, my name is Tom. I'm drinking. I can't stop drinking and I don't know what to do. And that's when just another piece of grace entered my life. And it was the beginning of a journey that I never thought was possible for me. I think my biggest problem was a second step one, actually, that I didn't think that what I saw happen for all of you could possibly happen for a guy like me. I had that sense of uniqueness, that sense of an impenetrable shame. And, I thought for some time that maybe I was that guy that they talk about in the big book and capable of developing a life based on rigorous honesty. But I've come to see since then that I, like any other person who's reluctant to recover, there are two types of alcoholics in my experience. Alcoholics in recovery who've cracked open, and alcoholics, hopefully, who will get to recovery who have yet to crack open. And I am here to witness that I was cracked open that time. So I think it is important that I start a little bit from the beginning. And I grew up in Rye, New York, a child of privilege. And I was the youngest of three. My older sister and brother were Eisenhower babies and were born during the Second World War. I was a child of the 60s and a Kennedy kid. And, my earliest years were magical. I can't trace alcoholism anywhere in our family history. But there's definitely a truth in the fact that my first addiction was to attention. I needed to be the center of attention, and that's what I craved. The next addiction I'm aware of was that of being addicted to sugar, long before I ever picked up a drink, although Lord knows I needed one. And I became a fat and chubby kid, But one of the hardest memories I have is actually when I was in like the fourth grade. They called all the kids to the nurse's office and everyone got weighed. And I remember when the nurse took my weight, she spoke it out loudly so the other nurse could record it. And it felt like they announced it to the entire PA system, and in that moment, that was the first sense memory that I have of that shame. And, that also fueled this sense of apartness and unworthiness, and it's that trance of unworthiness that's made up of these stories that we tell ourselves. I think that was what I was up against my whole life, and those stories just continued to build. Another really tough memory that I have, which came out in my fourth step was when I was in the fifth grade. Because I was a fat kid, I was picked on. And I remember these kids, my classmates, holding me down, and this, lead bully, ended up urinating on me. And all I can remember is their laughter. And so what happened was I built a fortress around my heart. And it was made up of these stories that I told myself. And when you were meeting me, you were actually meeting my bodyguard. 'cause I wasn't going to let you in, and my whole life I kept the world at a distance. And actually, if I were to describe recovery without words, it would be going from this to this. Very simply. The journey is from here to here. And the longest journey I got to make is that 18 inches from here to here. Real simple. And, but that was the longest journey I ever took, and one that continues today. So, my first drink was at, the big football game in college, at least in those days. Now it's the Big Ten and everything else, but was the Harvard-Yale game. And I found myself on the 50-yard line of the Harvard-Yale game, having been chauffeured up there, a friend of mine's father. And it was freezing. And he took out a flask of whiskey, silver flask in those days, passed it to Martin, my friend. He took it down. Obviously, he'd had a drink before. I'd never had a drink of alcohol before. He gave me a drink, and I felt this burning sensation going down in my chest. And then this sense of peace and comfort and the world just being right. And I said, this is for me. This life, this is for me. This is where I belong. This is my birthright. And that was the last drink I took for a while. But at the age of 12 and 13, they put me on Dexedrine, an amphetamine, to lose weight. And all of a sudden, I did experience a personality change. I was instant presto, poet, artist, and philosopher. And at the age of 12 and 13, I found myself walking down the streets of Greenwich Village singing The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. And again, it just accentuated the difference between, a sensitive, deep soul like myself searching for some ineffable wisdom that I just couldn't quite put my hands on, and all of you plebeians. And that's a hard thing to admit today, but it's, a core truth. And so I became a grind. I remember the next drink I took was at a ski house up in Vermont. There was a makeout pit downstairs. All the kids would pair off and go downstairs to the makeout pit. And there was no one for me to pair off with. And I took a drink, and the next thing I know is I was woken up in a blackout, passed out in a snowbank. That experience was to be repeated in my at my 11th grade prom, where my date ended up with another guy, and I ended up passed out in the bushes. So I was not a very successful alcoholic, but what happened to me is that I became very involved politically in the anti-war movement in the United States, and I was in a school where my classmates were for the war in Vietnam, and as I remember it, I was one of the most hated kids in my school. Later on, I got disabused of that notion. I went to my 50th anniversary, and this is one of the first awakenings I'll share with you. And going up the stairs to the anniversary, I was with my wife, and I said, Pat, I just don't know. Patty said, my wife, what we're going to find here. And I haven't seen any of these guys in over 50 years. And I went upstairs, and the welcome I received, Tom, how are you? Oh, my goodness, we missed you so much. We hadn't seen you. We hadn't heard of you. We didn't know what was going on with you. And I realized, I was given a gift that, I came to see immediately that what separates us is so much smaller than what we share in common. And that's such an important lesson for our lives today, and something I remember. So I got to college. I became a real grind. I ended up doing a deep dive in philosophy, and I thought that, like the person in the big book, that, I could wrest happiness and satisfaction out of this world if I only managed well. So I was one of 2 Americans invited over to the John Locke lectures at one of your esteemed colleges, and then came back to the States, gave up the world of philosophy. I started a feature film company, and had a lot of quick success. But even having, 6 films at 4 different studios at the age of 27 and 28 didn't do it for me. It was always, what am I going to do to top that act? And the intentions that I had in the beginning, which were to tell stories that could stimulate people's productive imagination or ask questions that people normally wouldn't ask themselves, turned into, the deal became more important than the stories, and I couldn't stand the person I became. And my drug use just went out of control. I'd gone from using cocaine recreational to being very addicted to it with the alcohol, seeking that balance, ended up on the opiates and was poured back on a plane to come home to die. And I survived. So after I came into AA back in 1980, I thought that somehow, as I had managed in my life, that I could beat this thing. What happened was that no matter what it says in our book, no matter what code of morals you have, the needed power wasn't there. For me, it was all about the distractions. So I started and I built a new business, same business I have today. And I became a periodic. I would go 2, 3, 4 years without a drink, abstinent. And then I would have a full, and the craving took over, and it would be 3-day bender. My wife was in a panic, and it was a lot of pain and suffering for those in my life, for sure. And this, by the way, was after I had been through 3 or 4 rehabs. Early on, I'd gotten in a marriage that was really ill-conceived. I had no conscious contact of my motives whatsoever. I had no 11-step practice. And I married a woman for the package, didn't understand what was inside. And that first wedding was filled with pomp and bullshit. But something really important happened then that I didn't realize till 30 years later, which was, and I know I've gone back a little bit and I apologize for the chronology relapse here, but it's important that I say this. My father, who was a very gentle and kind man, he was one of that greatest generation, had been in the Harvard Glee Club, and in the middle of all this, grandiosity, stood up and sang Aaron Copland's Simple Gifts, which is a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis a gift to come down where you ought to be. And fully in recovery, with a pretty deep 11-step practice, I realized something through the decades, that the gift that my father was telling me was that he hoped that I would find the most important things in life. This was his gift to me, this was his message to me, not judgmentally, but that he hoped that I would have that life experience. that I would come to experience what Bill talks about, in the 12th step. The true ambition, is a desire to live usefully and walk humbly under the grace of God. I was finally to get to that place, but the journey was a tough one. So, anyway, I came back and I started to work these steps with all my heart. In terms of a second step, I didn't know that it was possible for me to have the experience I saw other people have. But I was so thoroughly convinced that on my own power, I didn't have a shot, that I was rendered willing to do what all of you had done, actually decades before when I was here. And so I gave myself over to this program with everything I had, and part of my issue was, how do I find a belief in a higher power, when my whole world had been revolving around me, when I was the center and everything I thought of, felt, it was all about me. How could I have that experience? And I remember listening to a talk from the Dalai Lama. And a little girl had asked him a question. She said, "Your Holiness, if you were to have a religion, what would that religion be?" And he thought for a moment. He said, well, if I were to have a religion, I think that religion would be kindness. And all of a sudden, for me, a door opened. Somehow I heard a truth that was so powerful to me. And I said to myself, I can hang my hat on that. I can make a beginning with that. Let me see what that looks like in my life aspirationally. What can I do to get to a place where I can actually be a kind human being? And so I began the business of doing a 4-step. And I had written a 4-step before along the journey, and it was in the form of a spiritual autobiography. And it was great. You should have read it. It was epic. The only problem was it wasn't true. What it was a rehashing of what I thought had gone on. It was, a continuation of the delusions that I had about who I was and what I did and what I thought was important. And when I finally did the 4-step as it's prescribed in our big book, a columned inventory, I began to get free. What I did was, and I took that 4th column of, where was I wrong, and divided that into 2. One was what I said or did or didn't do or didn't say, the act, versus what the defect actually was, whether it was intolerant, indifferent, arrogant, dishonest, fearful, afraid. And then, as it's intimated in the book, I had a separate column for what would God have me be? What could I have done instead? Who would I be? Who would have shown up here otherwise? And what I was left with my 1st and 4th column was an 8th and 9th step list. And with my 5th and 6th column was a 6th and 7th step list. So I had a roadmap for entire program of recovery right there in those 3 inventories of resentment, fear, and harms done to others, sexual. And some amazing things have come out of that. I saw, for example, one of the things I was most embarrassed about is when I came into recovery very early, This is going back to 1984. My mother was dying of cancer. And I loved her dearly, but I was numb, and I was incapable of feeling grief for her. And I was so ashamed of that. And I was able to have real grief for her later. But to be able to admit that, because I just felt like such a small person, what kind of a unfeeling, hungry ghost could I be that I couldn't even feel grief for my own mother in my heart? I wanted you to think it, that I felt it. I wanted to appear like I had grief, but I was incapable of it. That's where this disease of alcoholism took me. That's not where the alcohol took me. That's where my disease, this obsession with self, this bondage of self took me. So I did a fifth step, and James Baldwin used to say, he said, I think why people cling to their anger and cling to their fear so fiercely is they're afraid, that they're not going to be able to live without the mask that they're wearing, and they couldn't live with it anymore. And they're afraid that if they touch that, they're going to have to deal with the pain. And in the fifth step, we get to share those things, that we've built up around our hearts. We get to begin to take down that fortress, one story at a time, one beam by beam, one post by post. And, all of a sudden, we begin to feel. We begin to let things in. We begin to start to live authentically. We get to have aspirations that we can start and begin to struggle to live up to in a real way, because it isn't us doing it any longer. We're doing it with the help of our fellows, and we're doing it with the help of a power greater than ourselves. And in the fifth step, when I admit to God, I begin to touch forgiveness. And when I admit it to another person, I begin to feel some humility. And when I admit it to myself, I have some self-awareness. And those things, forgiveness and humility and self-acceptance, these are all the necessary conditions for having compassion. And so the 6th and 7th step for me were, Passover steps. I had to come back to them later, and I will. I've got to wrap up the rest of this journey in 10 minutes, but I'm going to give it a good shot. So, anyway, I got to my 8th step, and what I'll say about my 8th step is the biggest takeaway from that is that when I finally became entirely willing to make amends to everyone that I owed an amend to, and that took some time, I finally had a sense of what that promise was. I finally found a new freedom that I didn't know existed for me. I no longer was carrying around this big stash of secrets. What you saw was what you got. And you weren't dealing with my bodyguard anymore. You were dealing with Tom, the man, and the guy. And I wasn't looking over my shoulder. And that was a real feeling of freedom. And in terms of the 9th step, I don't have time to talk about it all, but I'm going to talk to you about one thing I share when I share about the 9th step is the most important amend I made was the one I didn't make. And I'll tell you what that was about. And again, this was another awakening. So I wanted to make an amend to my oldest son, Andrew, who was probably hurt the most by my disappearing acts, by being in the weeds, his mother terrorized and unable to really care for him in those moments. Didn't understand what was going on, but he knew something was wrong. And so I made an appointment to make an amends with him. And I was on the phone with my spiritual advisor, and she said to me, so did you tell him why you wanted to meet with him? And I said, no, I didn't. And she goes, so what's your plan? Are you going to ambush him? And I said, no, okay, I'll tell him. And I said, Andrew, the reason I wanted to meet with you this weekend is I wanted to make amends with you. And he said, you know, Dad, I'm not ready for this conversation. I'm not ready for this talk. And I said, okay. It wasn't till a year and a half from that day that he was ready to have that talk with me. And the grace of God in that moment was that the amend that I would have made to him, which is to rob him of some security and some safety and some peace of mind, that's not the real harm I did to him. I wasn't able to see the real harm I had done to him because I couldn't have handled it. And the real harm that I did to him was in those relapses and in those disappearing acts. A 5-year-old and a 6-year-old child says, what's wrong with me? Aren't I enough? Doesn't my dad love me enough not to leave? And I had been the catalyst for that same trance of unworthiness in him that I had been suffering with my whole life. And that's the truth of the harm that I did to him. And guess what? In these past couple of years, especially where he's gone through some very dark days and is finally coming out of it, I've been able to do that in a way that's meaningful, in a way that gives purpose to my life. And it's one of the greatest gifts I've ever had, as difficult as that's been. And so, you know, I get to the 10th step, you know, and we learn how to watch for selfishness and anger and fear. We learn how to, when we are disturbed, you know, to do something about it, because it's always with us, you know. And the spiritual verbs is, you know, Sandy Beach tells us is, you know, we watch, we ask, you know, we pause and we turn. And in that pausing, this is where we have an opportunity to go back to a 6 and 7 step. They say in the program that God is in the pause. I believe that, yes, and that means we go back to the 6 and 7 step and we make that U-turn and we look about what's really going on in me. You know, what unaccepted powerlessness am I up against right now? You know, what old ideas, you know, am I clinging to that I need to let go of? You know, what new ideas, you know, am I resisting that I need to accept? You know, how am I making my life unmanageable for myself and for others in this moment? And my favorite 6 and 7 step story is in a parking space outside of a Warby Parker in Greenwich, Connecticut, and we want to leave, but there's a car double parked in back of us. And out walks, so 10 minutes goes by and I'm beginning to get a little impatient. 12 minutes and I can feel the bile starting to rise in my throat. You know, 15 minutes, I've got smoke coming out of my ears, and this Chinese gal around 35 walks out, coiffed in Armani, just to the nines. She saunters by me and goes, sorry, and gets in her 7 Series brand new BMW. And I say to her, have you no manners? Did your parents bring you up by the river eating roots? You know, what's the matter with you? And she gives me the finger and I go, oh, I can't believe I did this. And so I came home and I did some soul searching. And I said, how are you different than her? When there's a line on the highway to get off at an exit, and you scoot up to the front of the line and cut in, are you any different? Don't you think that your time is more valuable than hers? Aren't you guilty of exactly the same thing? And in that moment, I can go from that icy cold judgment to having some compassion for this person. I don't know what's going on in her day. I don't know what she's up against. And so I have a compassion tool for moments like that when we're in judgment. I want to share it with you. And it's called Just Like Me. And it says, this person has experienced joy and sorrow just like me. This person has experienced pain and pleasure just like me. This person has dreams and has longed for friendship just like me. This person has been sad, disappointed, and hurt just like me. This person has been angry and frightened just like me. This person wishes to be free from suffering just like me. This person wishes to be safe and healthy just like me. This person wishes to be happy and loved just like me. And so in this process of 6 and 7, this crucible of honesty, we get to make that shift, that these awakenings are all about, okay? And we get to return to a place where we're capable of compassion and we're capable of kindness again, and we're able to do that every day, with the tools of this program. And in terms of an 11th step, I got to get in touch with what my deepest intentions are, to be gentle and kind, to be trustworthy, to be authentic. I say that, the 5 AAs and the 5 A's in AA become being authentic, awake, aware, available, and accountable. That's what we get to become. To live impeccably, doing what I say and saying what I do. To live with an open and welcoming heart. To be an encouraging presence. That was the gift my grandparents gave me. That was a life lesson I came to understand in doing an 11-step practice. To listen deeply with a willingness to be changed by what I hear. I could give you another story which I love to share, but I don't have time, about what deep listening is about. But we need to really find that and touch it and bring it into our days. To speak wisely and to be a safe place. And what I realized, I'm going to finish in a minute, sorry. What I realized in the 11th step is that that's where I start my day. But I can take that process of having conscious contact with what my motives are into my day. And that if before I sit down with someone for a meal or get on a phone call or get home after a day's work, if I just take that sacred pause, that 30-second pause and say, what are my deepest intentions for this next encounter? What Tom is showing up here in this moment? Am I trying to connect or am I trying to impress? I don't want to impress anybody at this point in my life, but what I do want is to connect with each and every person that I meet. That's one of my highest goals. And that all is a result of working in 11-step practice with all my heart and trying to bring that into my days. In terms of 12-step, it's real simple. We say and we hear that, to keep it, you got to give it away. I'm here to testify to the fact that no, you have to give it away to get it. To get this thing, you got to give it away. Because until you have that experience, which must not be missed, of working with another alcoholic, not as a helper versus a helpee, but as a recovering person taking a journey, to the center of their lives. And you see that person going from, a state of being inconsolable and shut down and shut off to opening up and cracking open and embracing his life or her life. Man, nothing has ever brought me more joy than that experience, which I get to have all the time. And that's it for me, guys. Thanks so much.